The fire crackles softly as we begin tonight's journey into the heart of feudal Japan. Tonight, we journey into a world where death was preferable to dishonor, where warriors would slice open their own bellies rather than live with shame. The samurai of feudal Japan weren't just soldiers. They were living embodiments of a code so strict that failure meant ritual suicide. Before you settle in, perhaps adjust your pillow and let the gentle sounds of our fire transport you to ancient Japan, where honor was more precious than life itself. Welcome to the true story of the samurai, not the romanticized warriors of Hollywood films, but the complex, disciplined, and often tragic figures who shaped Japan for over 7 centuries. Tonight, as you drift into peaceful sleep, we'll explore how these legendary warriors actually lived, trained, fought, and when necessary, died with a grace that transformed violence into art and death into the ultimate expression of honor. So close your eyes, let the warmth of our fire embrace you, and prepare to enter a world where the cherry blossom and the sword blade shared the same fleeting beauty, where poetry and warfare walked hand in hand, and where every sunrise might be your last if honor demanded it. In the mist-shrouded mountains of ancient Japan, around the year 1000 CE, a new class of warrior was emerging from the chaos of a collapsing imperial system. These were not the samurai of legend yet. They were bushi, rough provincial fighters, hired by aristocratic families to protect their estates from bandits, rival clans, and the general lawlessness that plagued the countryside as central authority crumbled. Picture, if you will, the Japan of this era, a land where the emperor in Kyoto lived in splendid isolation, writing poetry and conducting elaborate court rituals, while the real power slipped away to local strongmen who ruled through force of arms. The elegant Heian court, with its silk-robed nobles and aesthetic refinements, was becoming increasingly irrelevant to the harsh realities of governing a fractured nation. It was in this environment that families like the Minamoto and Taira began to rise. These were not ancient aristocrats tracing their lineage to gods and emperors, but practical men who understood that in a world where might made right, the man with the sharpest sword and the most loyal followers would ultimately rule. They were the ancestors of the samurai, though they would not have recognized the elaborate code of honor that would later define their descendants. The early bushi were farmers turned warriors, men who could wield a hoe in spring and a sword in autumn with equal skill. They lived in wooden fortresses scattered across the Japanese countryside, surrounded by rice paddies that provided both sustenance and wealth. Their lives were governed not by abstract ideals of honor, but by the immediate necessities of survival, protection, and the accumulation of enough power to secure their families' futures. These early warriors developed what would become the foundation of samurai culture: absolute loyalty to one's lord, mastery of mounted archery, and a fierce pride in martial achievement. But their world was still crude, practical, and centered on the realities of medieval warfare, rather than the philosophical refinements that would later emerge. The transformation from simple fighting men to the complex warrior philosophers we know as samurai began with the rise of the first military government in Japanese history. In 1185, Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, creating a dual system of government that would define Japan for the next 7 centuries. The emperor remained as a symbolic figurehead in Kyoto, while real power rested with the shogun and his samurai followers. This new system required a new kind of warrior. No longer could the bushi be simple soldiers fighting for whoever paid them best. Now, they were the foundation of a government, administrators as well as fighters, men who needed to understand law, literature, and statecraft, in addition to the arts of war. The demands of governing began to transform crude fighting men into something approaching the cultured warrior aristocrats of later legend. The development of what we now call Bushido The way of the warrior was a gradual process that took centuries to fully mature. It began with simple concepts: loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, and honesty in all dealings. But as the samurai class consolidated its power and began to see itself as the natural rulers of Japan, these basic virtues were elaborated into an increasingly complex philosophical system. Buddhism, arriving from China and Korea, provided the spiritual framework that would give samurai culture its distinctive character. The Buddhist concept of impermanence, the idea that all things, including life itself, are transitory, resonated powerfully with warriors who faced death in every battle. From Buddhism came the samurai's famous acceptance of mortality and their ability to face death with equanimity. Confucianism contributed the emphasis on hierarchy, duty, and proper relationships between superior and inferior that became central to samurai social organization. A samurai's primary obligation was always to his lord, but this duty was embedded in a complex web of relationships that governed every aspect of daily life, from how to address superiors to how to conduct oneself in peacetime. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, provided the connection to the land and ancestors that gave samurai culture its distinctly Japanese character. The samurai saw themselves as inheritors of an ancient tradition stretching back to the legendary heroes of Japanese mythology, warriors whose spirits lived on in the sacred islands of Japan and continued to guide their descendants. The synthesis of these influences created something unique in world history: a warrior class that combined martial prowess with deep learning, political power with spiritual discipline, and practical effectiveness with aesthetic refinement. The samurai of the classical period were expected to be equally proficient with sword and brush, to compose poetry as skillfully as they planned military campaigns, and to approach death with the same grace they brought to the tea ceremony. But this transformation did not happen overnight, and it was not without its contradictions and tensions. The early samurai were often crude, violent men who paid little attention to the philosophical niceties that would later define their class. The evolution from warrior to warrior philosopher was driven as much by political necessity as by spiritual insight. The samurai needed to justify their dominance over the rest of Japanese society, and they did so by claiming to embody virtues that made them uniquely qualified to rule. The development of the samurai ideal was also shaped by the unique geography and history of Japan. As an island nation, Japan was largely isolated from the constant warfare that characterized mainland Asia. This isolation allowed Japanese warrior culture to develop along its own lines, creating institutions and ideals that had no exact parallels elsewhere in the world. The samurai's famous emphasis on honor, for example, was partly a product of Japan's small size and interconnected social structure. In a society where everyone knew everyone else, reputation became a form of currency more valuable than gold. A warrior who broke his word or acted dishonorably might find himself ostracized, not just by his immediate lord, but by the entire samurai class, a social death that was often worse than physical death. This social dynamic created powerful incentives for samurai to develop and maintain elaborate codes of behavior that governed every aspect of their lives. The man who mastered these codes and lived according to their demands was not just a warrior, but a work of art, a living embodiment of the ideals that Japanese society claimed to value most highly. By the end of the Kamakura period in 1333, the basic structure of samurai culture was in place. The warrior class had established itself as the de facto rulers of Japan, developed a distinctive philosophical framework to justify their dominance, and created institutions that would endure for centuries. But the golden age of the samurai was still to come, in the period when political chaos would provide the ultimate test of their codes and ideals. The approaching age of civil war would force the samurai to confront the contradictions within their own system and to decide what they truly valued most: political power, personal honor, or simple survival? The answers they gave to these questions would define not just their own fate, but the character of Japanese civilization for generations to come. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, imagine the sound of temple bells echoing across the mountains of medieval Japan, calling warriors to prayer at dawn before another day of training, governing, and preparing for whatever tests honor might demand. The way of the warrior was beginning to take shape, but its ultimate expression and its ultimate tragedy still lay ahead in the mists of an uncertain future. The transformation of a boy into a samurai began before he could walk. In the great houses of medieval Japan, male children born into the warrior class entered a world where every moment was designed to shape them into living weapons of uncompromising honor. This was not education as we understand it today, but rather a complete reconstruction of human nature itself, a process that would either create a perfect warrior or destroy the child in the attempt. Picture a 5-year-old boy in a samurai household of the 14th century, perhaps the son of a minor daimyo whose family has served the same lord for 3 generations. His day begins before sunrise with the sound of wooden clappers announcing the start of formal training. While children of other classes might spend these early hours playing or helping with farm work, this boy's childhood is structured around a single, overwhelming purpose: preparing for a life where failure means death and dishonor means something worse than death. The physical training began with basics that would challenge grown men. Young samurai in training were expected to endure cold that would numb their fingers, heat that would leave them dizzy with exhaustion, and hunger that would teach them to function when their bodies screamed for relief. They slept on hard wooden floors, bathed in ice-cold mountain streams, regardless of season, and learned to ignore pain as merely another form of weather, unpleasant perhaps, but not worthy of complaint or comment. Swordsmanship training started with wooden practice blades that were deliberately heavier than the real weapons they would eventually wield. Hours each day were spent in repetitive drills, practicing the same cuts and thrusts until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The goal was not just technical proficiency, but the development of what the Japanese called no mind, a state of perfect awareness in which action flowed directly from perception without the interference of thought or hesitation. But the samurai's signature weapon was not the sword, it was the bow. Mounted archery, or yabusame, was considered the highest expression of samurai martial skill, combining horsemanship, accuracy, and split-second timing in a display that was as much art as warfare. Young samurai spent countless hours learning to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, sometimes aiming at targets no larger than a human head, while their horses thundered across uneven terrain. The philosophical training was every bit as demanding as the physical preparation. Young samurai were drilled in Chinese classics, Japanese poetry, and Buddhist scripture, not for their own sake, but because these texts contained the moral and intellectual framework they would need to navigate the complex demands of warrior life. A samurai who could not compose poetry was considered as deficient as one who could not handle a sword. Both skills were essential components of the complete warrior. The concept of death was introduced early and reinforced constantly. Children were taught to view their lives as temporary gifts that could be returned to their lord at any moment, for any reason he deemed sufficient. They learned the proper forms of seppuku, ritual suicide, and were expected to practice the motions until they could perform them with the same graceful precision they brought to flower arrangement or calligraphy. This training in mortality was not meant to make children morbid or fearful, but rather to free them from the fear of death that might interfere with their duty. A samurai who feared death might hesitate in battle, might consider surrender when honor demanded a final charge, or might value his own life above his lord's commands. Such considerations were luxuries that no true warrior could afford. The social dimensions of samurai training were equally important. Young warriors learned to navigate the complex hierarchies that governed every interaction within their class. They studied the proper forms of address for different ranks, the subtle gradations of respect that must be shown to various categories of superiors, and the equally important art of gracefully accepting deference from those below them in the social order. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to recognize and respond appropriately to challenges to their honor. The samurai class was obsessed with reputation, and even minor slights could escalate into matters of life and death, if not handled with perfect correctness. Young samurai practiced the delicate art of defending their honor without unnecessary provocation, while also understanding that some insults could only be answered with blood. The role of mentorship was crucial in this process. Each young samurai was typically assigned to an older warrior who served not just as a teacher, but as a model of everything the student hoped to become. These relationships were often more intimate and influential than those between father and son, creating bonds of loyalty and affection that could last entire lifetimes. The mentor's responsibility was total. He shaped not just his students' martial skills, but his character, his aesthetic sensibilities, and his understanding of what it meant to live and die as a true warrior. A mentor who failed in this duty brought shame not just upon himself, but upon his entire lineage. Conversely, a student who dishonored his teacher's instruction was seen as having betrayed a sacred trust that could never be repaired. The process of forging a samurai typically took 15 to 20 years, beginning in early childhood and continuing until the young man was ready to take his place as a full member of the warrior class. The graduation ceremony, known as genpuku, or coming of age, was the elaborate ritual that marked the end of childhood and the beginning of a life dedicated to service and honor. During genpuku, the young man would receive his adult name, his first real sword, and formal recognition as a samurai in his own right. But perhaps most significantly, he would take the oaths that bound him to his lord and to the code of behavior that would govern every aspect of his future life. From this moment forward, he was no longer a child learning to be a warrior, but a warrior whose every action reflected upon the honor of his family, his teacher, and his class. The psychological effects of this intensive training were profound and often disturbing by modern standards. Young samurai learned to suppress normal human emotions that might interfere with their duty. Fear, certainly, but also pity, doubt, and even basic self-preservation instincts. They were taught to view themselves not as individuals with personal desires and goals, but as instruments in the hands of their superiors, valuable only insofar as they could serve effectively. This conditioning created warriors of extraordinary effectiveness and legendary loyalty, but it also produced human beings who often struggled to function in peacetime or to form normal emotional relationships. The samurai class was notorious for its high rates of suicide, domestic violence, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, all consequences of a training system that prioritized martial effectiveness above psychological health. Yet, for all its harshness, the samurai training system also produced men of remarkable accomplishment and genuine nobility. The best samurai were not just skilled killers, but scholars, poets, artists, and administrators whose contributions to Japanese culture extended far beyond the battlefield. They embodied an ideal of human excellence that, while alien to modern sensibilities, represented a serious attempt to create beings who could transcend the limitations of ordinary humanity. The weapons they carried were not just tools of war, but extensions of their souls, crafted with a care and artistry that elevated metalworking to the level of spiritual practice. The famous katana, the curved, single-edged sword that became the symbol of the samurai class, was not just a weapon, but a work of art, a spiritual focus, and a symbol of the warrior's soul. The process of creating a katana was itself a form of meditation and spiritual discipline. Master swordsmiths would purify themselves through fasting and prayer before beginning work, and the forging process could take months of careful heating, folding, and tempering to achieve the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility that made these blades legendary. The finished sword was believed to possess a spirit of its own, and samurai would often give their weapons names and treat them with the respect due to living beings. To lose one's sword was a catastrophic disgrace, while to break it in honorable battle was seen as a form of shared martyrdom between warrior and weapon. As you sink deeper into peaceful sleep, imagine the ring of hammer on anvil echoing through mountain valleys, where master smiths worked their ancient magic, transforming raw iron into blades that could cut through armor and souls with equal ease. The samurai and their swords were being forged together in fires that burned hotter than any earthly flame. Fires of discipline, honor, and absolute dedication to an ideal that would rather die than compromise. The boy who entered this process was destined either to emerge as something more than human or to be broken entirely in the attempt. There was no middle ground in the way of the warrior, no room for partial commitment or qualified loyalty. The samurai were being shaped into instruments of perfection, and perfection, as any craftsman knows, requires the willingness to destroy anything that falls short of the ideal. Tomorrow's training would begin before dawn, as it had every day since they were old enough to hold a wooden sword. But tonight, in the brief respite between day's demands and tomorrow's challenges, even future samurai were allowed to rest, to dream perhaps of cherry blossoms floating on spring winds, or of ancestors watching approvingly from the realm of spirits. The way of death was also, paradoxically, a way of life, and life, however disciplined and directed, still required its moments of peace. In the heart of samurai culture lay a paradox that would define Japanese civilization for centuries. Warriors who killed with the precision of surgeons and the aesthetic sensibility of poets. The development of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a single moment of revelation, but rather the slow crystallization of practical necessities into spiritual imperatives, of military tactics into moral philosophy, of survival strategies into an art form that elevated death itself to the level of high drama. The classical period of samurai culture, roughly from 1200 to 1600, saw the emergence of the elaborate code that would govern every aspect of a warrior's life from the moment he first picked up a wooden practice sword until the instant he drew his blade across his own belly in ritual suicide. This was Bushido in its mature form, not merely a set of military regulations, but a comprehensive worldview that sought to transform the brutal necessities of medieval warfare into expressions of the highest human virtues. Central to this philosophy was the concept of loyalty, ji, which demanded that a samurai place his lord's interests above his own life, his family's welfare, or any other consideration. But this was not the simple obedience of a soldier following orders. It was a mystical devotion that transformed the relationship between master and servant into something approaching the sacred. A true samurai did not merely serve his daimyo. He became an extension of his lord's will, a living weapon whose only purpose was to manifest his master's intentions in the physical world. This absolute loyalty was beautifully illustrated in the famous story of the 47 Ronin, masterless samurai, who spent years planning and executing revenge for their lord's forced suicide, knowing that their success would inevitably lead to their own deaths. When they finally achieved their goal and presented their master's enemy's head at his grave, they calmly prepared for seppuku, having fulfilled their duty regardless of the personal cost. Their story became the ultimate expression of samurai loyalty, demonstrating that death was not the end of service, but rather its perfect completion. Courage, was understood not simply as fearlessness in battle, but as the moral strength to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. A samurai was expected to face death with equanimity, But more challenging still, he was expected to face life with the same unflinching resolve. This meant speaking truth to power when necessary, protecting the weak even at personal cost, and maintaining one's principles even when surrounded by corruption and compromise. The samurai conception of courage was deeply influenced by Buddhist teachings about the impermanence of all things. If life itself was transitory, no more permanent than cherry blossoms that bloomed and fell within a few brief weeks, then attachment to life became a form of delusion. The warrior who truly understood this teaching could face any danger with perfect calm, knowing that he was simply participating in the natural flow of existence, from birth to death to rebirth. Honor, Meiyo, was perhaps the most complex and demanding aspect of the samurai code. It encompassed not just courage and loyalty, but also honesty, justice, and a refined aesthetic sensibility that governed everything from warfare to poetry composition. A samurai's honor was not simply his own possession, but the property of his entire lineage, extending backward to his ancestors and forward to generations yet unborn. To lose one's honor was thus not merely a personal failure, but a cosmic disaster that corrupted the very foundation of existence. The practical demands of maintaining honor in a complex social environment required samurai to develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to matters of reputation and respect. They learned to detect the subtlest signs of disrespect or challenge, to calibrate their responses with mathematical precision, and to choose death over dishonor with the same casual ease that other men might choose one meal over another. This obsession with honor created a society of extraordinary politeness and equally extraordinary violence. Samurai interactions were governed by elaborate codes of etiquette designed to prevent accidental insults. But when offenses did occur, the response was swift and deadly. A careless word or gesture could trigger a duel to the death, and even accidental slights might require formal apologies that included offers to commit suicide as proof of sincerity. Rectitude, GI, demanded that samurai maintain the highest standards of moral behavior even when no one was watching. This was not merely a matter of following rules, but of embodying the very essence of justice and righteousness. A true samurai was expected to be incorruptible, honest in all dealings, and willing to sacrifice personal advantage for the sake of moral principle. The integration of these virtues created a personality type that was unique in world history. The warrior poet, equally capable of composing delicate haiku and cutting down enemies with devastating efficiency. Samurai were expected to cultivate refinement and sensitivity alongside their martial skills, understanding that true strength required not just physical power, but also intellectual sophistication and emotional depth. This aesthetic dimension of samurai culture was not mere decoration, but an essential component of the warrior's spiritual development. The tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and poetry composition were not leisure activities, but forms of training that developed the focus, precision, and appreciation of beauty that were considered essential to effective combat. A warrior who could not appreciate the subtle beauty of a perfectly arranged flower might also miss the subtle opening in an enemy's defense. The seasonal consciousness that pervaded samurai culture reflected this integration of aesthetic and martial concerns. Spring, with its cherry blossoms, was associated with the beauty and transience of life, perfect metaphors for the warrior's existence. Summer represented the heat of battle and the full flowering of martial skills. Autumn, with its falling leaves, symbolized the acceptance of mortality and the preparation for death. Winter was the time of endurance and inner strength, when the warrior's training was tested by hardship and adversity. This cyclical understanding of existence helped samurai maintain psychological equilibrium in the face of constant violence and uncertainty. Life was not a straight line from birth to death, but rather a series of seasons, each with its own beauty and appropriate activities. Death was not an ending but a transition, no more final than winter's conclusion or a flower's falling. The influence of Zen Buddhism on samurai culture was particularly profound, providing both practical techniques for mental discipline and philosophical frameworks for understanding the nature of existence. Zen meditation taught warriors to achieve the state of no mind that was essential for effective combat, a condition of perfect awareness without the interference of conscious thought or emotional disturbance. In this state, action flowed directly from perception without delay or hesitation. The samurai's sword became an extension of his body an extension of his mind, and his mind a clear mirror reflecting the immediate demands of each moment. This was not mere fighting technique, but a form of spiritual realization that transformed violence into a means of self-discovery and self-transcendence. The tea ceremony provided another avenue for developing this refined awareness. The precise movements required for proper tea preparation, the careful attention to each detail of the ritual, and the cultivation of sensitivity to seasonal and aesthetic concerns all contributed to the mental discipline that made samurai so formidable in battle. A warrior who could maintain perfect composure while performing the elaborate choreography of the tea ceremony could certainly maintain his calm in the chaos of combat. Poetry, particularly the highly compressed form known as haiku, offered samurai a means of expressing the intense emotions and insights that arose from their unique way of life. The discipline required to capture complex feelings and observations in just 17 syllables paralleled the precision needed for effective sword work, while the emphasis on natural imagery and seasonal references reinforced the warrior's connection to the larger rhythms of existence. Many of the most famous haiku in Japanese literature were composed by samurai, often at moments of particular intensity or significance. Poems written just before battle, during long campaigns, or in preparation for seppuku provide unique insights into the inner lives of men who face death as a constant companion. These verses reveal not bloodthirsty killers, but sensitive individuals who found beauty and meaning even in the midst of violence and uncertainty. The social structure that supported samurai culture was equally complex and carefully articulated. The relationship between lord and retainer was not simply economic, but spiritual, creating bonds of loyalty that transcended rational calculation. A daimyo was responsible not just for his samurai's material welfare, but for their spiritual development and moral education. In return, his followers owed him not just military service, but complete devotion that extended beyond death itself. This system created webs of loyalty and obligation that could span generations and survive even the destruction of the original political arrangements that had created them. Samurai families served the same lord's lineage for centuries, developing traditions and customs that reinforced their bonds of service, while also creating distinctive cultural identities within the larger framework of warrior society. The relationship between samurai and the rest of Japanese society was equally important and far more complex than simple domination by a military elite. While samurai certainly possessed the power of life and death over commoners, they were also bound by their code to protect and care for those under their authority. The ideal samurai was not a tyrant, but a benevolent protector, whose strength served justice rather than self-interest. This protective function was not merely theoretical, but was reinforced by practical arrangements that gave commoners legal recourse against samurai who abused their power. While such recourse was limited and often ineffective, the very existence of these protections reflected the samurai's understanding that their position in society depended upon their ability to fulfill their obligations as well as exercise their privileges. The economic foundation of samurai society was equally important in shaping the warrior's worldview and behavior. Unlike European knights, who typically held land directly, Japanese samurai were usually supported by rice stipends paid by their lords. This arrangement made them dependent upon the continued goodwill of their superiors, while also freeing them from the day-to-day responsibilities of managing agricultural estates. This economic dependence reinforce the psychological bonds of loyalty that were central to samurai culture, making rebellion against one's lord not just a matter of honor, but also a form of economic suicide. A masterless samurai, a ronin, faced not just social disgrace, but also material destitution, as few alternative sources of income were available to men trained primarily for warfare and administration. The result was a warrior class that was simultaneously more dependent and more loyal than their counterparts in other feudal societies. European knights might rebel against their overlords and seek new masters if better terms were offered elsewhere. But Japanese samurai were bound to their lords by ties that were emotional, spiritual, and economic all at once. As you drift deeper into sleep tonight, imagine the sound of bamboo fountains in hidden gardens where samurai practiced their meditation, the whisper of silk robes as warriors moved through their daily rituals, and the soft scrape of brush on paper as they composed poems that captured the eternal tension between the beauty of life and the necessity of death. The way of the warrior was reaching its full flowering, creating human beings who embodied paradoxes that would have destroyed lesser spirits. Gentle killers, aesthetic warriors, and men who found life's deepest meaning in preparation for death. The cherry blossoms that bloomed and fell each spring became the perfect symbol for this impossible synthesis. Beautiful beyond words, precious beyond measure, and gone almost before they could be fully appreciated. Like the samurai themselves, they achieved perfection precisely because they accepted their own transience, finding in impermanence not cause for despair, but reason for celebration of each perfect fleeting moment. In the twilight hours before dawn, when mist clings to the temples of medieval Japan and the world stands suspended between night and day, we encounter perhaps the most distinctive and disturbing aspect of samurai culture: the elevation of suicide to the level of high art. Seppuku, the ritual disembowelment that Western observers would later call harakiri, was not merely a method of execution or a desperate escape from shame, but rather the ultimate expression of everything the samurai held sacred: control over one's fate, loyalty to one's principles, and the transformation of even death into a gesture of transcendent beauty. To understand seppuku, we must first abandon our modern assumptions about the value and meaning of life. The samurai did not view existence as an end in itself, but rather as a temporary condition that could be molded, shaped, and ultimately sacrificed in service of higher ideals. Death was not the enemy to be avoided at all costs, but rather a partner to be embraced when circumstances demanded it. The warrior who mastered the art of dying had achieved the final victory over circumstance, fear, and the chaos of existence itself. The ritual of seppuku developed gradually over centuries, becoming increasingly elaborate and aesthetically refined as samurai culture matured. In its classical form, the ceremony was a carefully choreographed performance that could take hours to complete and required the participation of multiple individuals, each playing a precisely defined role in the drama of honorable death. The condemned man, for it was almost always a man, though there are records of samurai women performing a similar ritual called jigai, would prepare himself through purification rituals that might last for days. He would fast, bathe repeatedly, meditate, and compose death poems that captured his final thoughts and feelings. These preparations were not merely practical necessities, but spiritual exercises designed to achieve the perfect state of mind required for the ultimate sacrifice. The ceremony itself typically took place in a garden or other beautiful setting, surrounded by witnesses whose presence validated the act and ensured that proper forms were observed. The condemned man would be dressed in white robes, the color of death and purification, and would kneel on a white mat that had been carefully positioned to catch his blood. Before him would be placed a short blade, often wrapped in white paper and presented on a small table or tray. The actual moment of seppuku required extraordinary mental discipline and physical courage. The condemned man would take the blade and insert it into the left side of his abdomen, drawing it slowly across to the right, in a motion that would open his belly and allow his intestines to spill forth. The pain was unimaginable, but the ideal was to maintain perfect composure throughout the process, neither crying out nor allowing one's face to show the agony being endured. In many cases, a trusted friend or retainer would serve as kaishakunin, literally second, standing behind the condemned man with a sword ready to decapitate him at the moment when the belly cutting was complete, or when it became clear that the condemned could no longer maintain his composure. This final blow was considered an act of compassion, ending the sufferer's agony while preserving his dignity by preventing any unseemly display of pain or fear. The psychological dimensions of seppuku were as important as the physical act itself. The ritual served multiple functions within samurai society. It provided a way for disgraced warriors to restore their honor, demonstrated absolute loyalty to one's lord or principles, and created a final moment of perfect control in a life that might have been shaped by forces beyond one's influence. For a samurai who had failed in his duty, committed a serious error, or found himself in an impossible position, seppuku offered a way to transform defeat into victory, shame into honor, and helplessness into the ultimate expression of personal agency. The man who could choose the moment and manner of his death had achieved a form of freedom that no enemy could take away and no superior could deny. The political uses of seppuku were equally important. A retainer might commit suicide to demonstrate his loyalty when his lord died, to protest an unjust decision, or to accept responsibility for his subordinates' failures. Such deaths served as powerful forms of communication within the complex social hierarchies of samurai society, conveying messages that could not be spoken directly without challenging the authority of one's superiors. The famous example of the 47 Ronin illustrates many of these dynamics. When their lord was forced to commit seppuku after attacking a court official who had repeatedly humiliated him, his retainers found themselves masterless and dishonored. Rather than accepting this fate, they spent years planning and executing revenge against their master's enemy, knowing that success would require their own deaths. Their subsequent seppuku transformed them from failed retainers into eternal symbols of perfect loyalty, demonstrating that death could be a form of victory when properly understood and executed. The aesthetic dimensions of seppuku were perhaps even more important than its political functions. The ceremony represented the ultimate fusion of samurai values: martial courage, aesthetic refinement, spiritual discipline, and absolute commitment to principle. The condemned man was expected to approach his death with the same attention to beauty and form that he brought to poetry composition or flower arrangement. The death poems composed before seppuku often rank among the finest examples of Japanese literature, capturing in just a few lines the complex emotions and insights of men facing their final moments. These verses typically reference the transience of existence, the beauty of the natural world, and the peace that comes from accepting one's fate with grace and dignity. One famous example comes from the 16th century general Otadokan, who wrote just before his seppuku, "Had I not known that I was already dead, I would have mourned my loss of life." This poem captures the essential paradox of samurai death. The man who has truly accepted the transience of existence has already died to attachment and fear, making the physical act of dying merely the completion of a spiritual process that began long before. The preparation of the suicide site was also considered an art form. Gardens were carefully arranged to provide proper aesthetic settings. Seasonal elements were incorporated to emphasize themes of transience and natural beauty, and every detail from the arrangement of mats to the presentation of the blade was designed to create an atmosphere of solemn dignity. The training for seppuku began in childhood and continued throughout a samurai's life. Young warriors practiced the proper forms, learned to overcome their natural fear of pain and death, and developed the mental discipline required to maintain composure in extremity. This training was not morbid preparation for an inevitable fate, but rather a form of spiritual exercise that freed the warrior from the fear that might otherwise interfere with his duty. The influence of Buddhist philosophy on seppuku was profound and pervasive. The Buddhist understanding of existence as suffering, the doctrine of impermanence, and the ideal of non-attachment all supported the samurai's acceptance of death as a natural and potentially beautiful conclusion to life. Zen meditation practices provided practical techniques for achieving the mental states required for perfect seppuku, while Buddhist cosmology offered reassurance that death was not an ending, but a transition to new forms of existence. The relationship between master and disciple in the context of seppuku reveals another important aspect of samurai culture: the transmission of wisdom through extreme experience. Masters would often instruct their students not just in the technical aspects of ritual suicide, but in the philosophical and spiritual preparation required to face death with dignity. These teachings went far beyond mere technique. Students learned to cultivate detachment from worldly concerns, to find beauty even in moments of extremity, and to understand death not as failure, but as the completion of a life lived according to principle. The master who could guide his disciple to a perfect death had fulfilled his highest responsibility as a teacher and spiritual guide. The social dynamics surrounding seppuku were equally complex. While the act itself was intensely personal, it took place within a community that shared responsibility for ensuring that proper forms were observed and that the condemned man's sacrifice achieved its intended meaning. Witnesses were not mere spectators, but active participants in a ritual that required their emotional and spiritual engagement. The kaishakunin bore perhaps the heaviest burden of all. This trusted companion had to possess not only the technical skill to deliver a clean, merciful death blow, but also the emotional strength to kill someone he often loved and respected. The timing of the final cut required perfect judgment. Too early, and the condemned man would be denied his moment of supreme self-sacrifice. Too late, and his suffering would become unseemly spectacle rather than noble death. Many kaishakunin reported that performing this service was among the most difficult and emotionally devastating experiences of their lives, yet also among the most meaningful. To be chosen for this role was a mark of ultimate trust and respect, an acknowledgement that one possessed the spiritual strength to participate in another man's moment of transcendence. The economic aspects of seppuku also reflect the complex values of samurai society. A warrior who died honorably through ritual suicide often secured better treatment for his family than one who died in disgrace or lived in shame. Lords were expected to provide for the widows and children of retainers who had demonstrated perfect loyalty through seppuku, while the families of disgraced samurai might face poverty and social ostracism. This practical dimension reinforced the spiritual motivations for seppuku, creating a social system in which honorable death became not just a personal choice, but an economic strategy for protecting one's descendants. The samurai who chose seppuku was often making a calculated sacrifice of his own life for his family's future welfare. The regional variations in seppuku practices reveal how this ritual adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining its essential character. In some areas, the ceremony was relatively simple and focused primarily on the spiritual dimensions of the act. In others, elaborate protocols developed that could extend the ritual for hours and involve dozens of participants. Some domains developed distinctive aesthetic traditions associated with seppuku, particular arrangements of seasonal flowers, specific forms of poetry, or unique ceremonial implements that reflected local tastes and values. These variations demonstrate how even the most solemn and universal aspects of samurai culture were shaped by regional identities and local traditions. The seasonal timing of seppuku was also considered significant. Spring deaths were associated with the beauty and transience of cherry blossoms, autumn deaths with the poignant beauty of falling leaves, winter deaths with endurance and purification, and summer deaths with the peak of life's intensity. The condemned man's choice of timing could thus become part of his final message to the world. The literature that emerged from seppuku culture provides some of our deepest insights into the samurai mind. Death poems, letters to family members, and accounts by witnesses create a rich archive of human responses to the ultimate test of courage and conviction. These documents reveal not Superman immune to fear and doubt, but human beings who achieve transcendence through the disciplined application of spiritual and psychological techniques. Many of these accounts describe a transformation that occurred during the final preparations for seppuku, a movement from fear and anxiety to a state of profound peace and clarity. This transformation was not automatic, but required years of preparation and extraordinary mental discipline. The samurai who achieved it had demonstrated the ultimate victory of spirit over circumstance. The international reactions to seppuku when it was first encountered by Western observers in the 16th and 17th centuries reveal how alien these practices seemed to cultures that valued life preservation above honor preservation. European missionaries and traders were simultaneously horrified and fascinated by warriors who could commit suicide with the same calm precision they brought to flower arrangement. These cultural encounters force both sides to confront fundamental questions about the nature and value of human existence. The samurai practice of seppuku challenged Western assumptions about the sanctity of life, while European emphasis on life preservation challenged samurai assumptions about the relative importance of honor and survival. As the night deepens around our glowing fire, we can almost hear the whispered prayers and final poems of countless samurai who chose death over dishonor, who found in the ultimate sacrifice not an ending but a beginning, not defeat but the final victory over all the forces that sought to compromise their integrity. Their example, terrible and beautiful in equal measure, would continue to shape Japanese culture for centuries to come, creating a legacy that was simultaneously inspiring and deeply troubling. The way of death had become an art form, a spiritual practice, and a social institution all at once. In mastering it, the samurai had achieved something unique in human history, the transformation of life's greatest terror into its greatest beauty, of ultimate helplessness into perfect control, of the most solitary human experience into a form of communion with the deepest values of their civilization. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of courage and loyalty, new opportunities to demonstrate the principles they held dearer than life itself. But tonight, in the brief respite between day's duties and tomorrow's trials, even the most disciplined warrior could rest, could dream perhaps of spring gardens where cherry blossoms drifted like snow, or of mountain temples where the sound of temple bells marked the eternal rhythm of birth, death, and rebirth that governed all existence. The fire burns lower now, but the light it casts illuminates truths that transcend any single culture or historical period. That human beings are capable of extraordinary nobility when they commit themselves completely to ideals larger than their own survival. That beauty can be found even in the darkest circumstances, when approached with the proper spirit, and that death itself can become a teacher for those brave enough to face its lessons without flinching. As the 15th century dawned over Japan, the country stood on the threshold of an era that would test every principle, every ideal, and every assumption that had shaped samurai culture for the previous 3 centuries. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, was about to begin, and with it would come challenges that would either forge the samurai into their ultimate form or destroy them entirely in the crucible of constant warfare. Picture Japan in the year 1467, a land where the Ashikaga shogunate maintained the fiction of central authority from Kyoto, while real power had long since fragmented among dozens of daimyo who ruled their domains like independent kingdoms. The emperor continued to perform his ancient rituals in ceremonial isolation, but his political relevance had dwindled to near invisibility. Into this power vacuum stepped ambitious warlords who saw opportunity in chaos and were prepared to gamble everything for the chance to unite Japan under their own rule. The Onin War, which erupted in 1467 and devastated Kyoto for over a decade, marked the beginning of this new age. What started as a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family quickly became a proxy war between rival alliances that drew in virtually every major samurai house in Japan. The fighting was bitter, destructive, and ultimately inconclusive. When it finally ended in 1477, neither side had achieved decisive victory, but the central government's authority had been so thoroughly undermined that it would never recover. In the aftermath of the Onin War, Japan entered a period of almost constant warfare that would last for over a century. This was not the ritualized combat of earlier eras, where small armies of mounted samurai fought according to elaborate codes of honor and aesthetic refinement. The Sengoku period brought total war to Japan. Massive armies, innovative tactics, new weapons, and a level of violence and destruction that dwarfed anything the country had previously experienced. The samurai who emerged as leaders during this period were a new breed of warrior. Men like Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, and Wasugi Kenshin, who combined traditional martial virtues with strategic brilliance, political cunning, and a willingness to innovate that would have shocked their ancestors. These were not simply fighters, but generals, administrators, and visionaries who understood that survival in the new age required more than personal courage and loyalty to traditional forms. Oda Nobunaga, perhaps the most revolutionary of these warlords, exemplified both the possibilities and the dangers of this transformation. Born into a relatively minor samurai family, Nobunaga used superior tactics, innovative technology, and ruthless pragmatism to build an empire that stretched across central Japan. He was the first Japanese commander to make systematic use of firearms, deploying formations of ashigaru, foot soldiers, armed with matchlock muskets in ways that revolutionized Japanese warfare. But Nobunaga's innovations went far beyond military technology. He was also one of the first daimyo to recognize that economic power was the foundation of military success, and he implemented policies designed to increase agricultural productivity, promote trade, and accumulate the wealth necessary to support large standing armies. Under his rule, traditional samurai values of honor and aesthetic refinement gave way to a more practical emphasis on results and effectiveness. Nobunaga's treatment of religious institutions particularly scandalized traditional samurai, who had always seen themselves as protectors of Buddhism and supporters of spiritual authority. When Buddhist monasteries opposed his rule or sheltered his enemies, Nobunaga responded with devastating force, burning temples, massacring monks, and destroying religious artifacts that had been revered for centuries. His assault on the Enryaku-ji monastery on Mount Hiei in 1571 was particularly shocking. He ordered the complete destruction of one of Japan's most sacred Buddhist centers, killing thousands of monks and destroying buildings and treasures that had accumulated over 7 centuries. Such actions would have been unthinkable for earlier generations of samurai, who saw themselves as bound by religious as well as secular obligations. But Nobunaga represented a new type of warrior ruler who was willing to subordinate all traditional restraints to the demands of military and political success. He was not rejecting samurai values so much as redefining them around a single overwhelming priority: the unification of Japan under his personal rule. The technological revolution that accompanied the Sengoku Wars also challenged traditional samurai assumptions about warfare and honor. The introduction of firearms to Japan in 1543 by Portuguese traders created weapons that could kill experienced samurai with the same efficiency they killed untrained peasants. A farmer's son, with a few weeks of musket training, could now bring down a warrior whose family had spent generations perfecting the arts of swordsmanship and mounted archery. This democratization of military effectiveness had profound implications for samurai culture and self-understanding. If personal skill and lifetime training could be negated by mass-produced weapons operated by common soldiers, what was the unique value of the samurai class? How could warriors maintain their sense of superiority and special destiny when their traditional military advantages were being eroded by technological change? Different samurai leaders responded to these challenges in different ways. Some, like Nobunaga, embraced the new technology and reorganized their armies around formations of gunners supported by traditional samurai cavalry and infantry. Others, like Takeda Shingen, maintained more conservative approaches that emphasized traditional mounted warfare and treated firearms as useful supplements to, rather than replacements for, conventional samurai tactics. The Takeda cavalry charges that became legendary during this period represented the old samurai ideals taken to their absolute extreme. Perfectly trained horsemen armed with spears and swords, charging enemy formations with such disciplined ferocity that they could break even well-prepared defensive positions. Takeda Shingen's mounted samurai were the last great flowering of the classical warrior tradition, magnificent, terrifying, and ultimately doomed by their inability to adapt to the changing nature of warfare. The climactic encounter between these two approaches came at the Battle of Nagakute in 1573, where Nobunaga's innovative combination of firearms, fortifications, and coordinated infantry tactics decimated Takeda Katsuyori's traditional cavalry charges. The destruction of the Takeda forces marked not just a military victory, but the end of an era, the triumph of pragmatic innovation over traditional honor, of collective discipline over individual heroism, of effectiveness over aesthetic perfection. Yet even as traditional samurai tactics were being revolutionized, the underlying values of samurai culture continued to exert powerful influence over the warriors of the Sengoku period. The loyalty that bound retainers to their lords remained absolute, even when those lords pursued policies that violated traditional moral constraints. The emphasis on personal honor and reputation continued to shape individual behavior, even within armies that increasingly resembled modern military organizations rather than feudal war bands. The poetry and personal accounts that survive from this period reveal samurai grappling with the tension between their inherited ideals and the harsh realities of total war. Many warriors composed verses expressing their commitment to traditional values, even as they participated in campaigns that violated those values. Others wrote of their confusion and distress at finding themselves in situations where honor and effectiveness seemed to demand contradictory actions. This psychological tension was perhaps most evident in the treatment of prisoners and civilians during Sengoku warfare. Traditional samurai values emphasized protecting the innocent and treating defeated enemies with respect, but the scale and intensity of Sengoku conflicts made such niceties increasingly impractical. Daimyo who showed excessive mercy to defeated rivals often found themselves betrayed and destroyed, while those who pursued policies of systematic intimidation and elimination were more likely to survive and prosper. The result was a gradual brutalization of samurai culture that would have horrified earlier generations of warriors. Massacres of civilian populations, torture of prisoners, and destruction of cultural and religious sites became common features of Sengoku warfare. justified as necessary measures for achieving the greater good of national unification. The samurai who participated in these activities often felt genuine anguish about their actions, but they continued to carry them out because their loyalty to their lords demanded it. The scale of Sengoku warfare also transformed the economics of samurai life in fundamental ways. The small-scale conflicts of earlier periods had been affordable luxuries that ambitious daimyo could pursue without bankrupting their domains, but the massive armies and prolonged campaigns of the Age of Warring States required unprecedented financial resources. Traditional agricultural revenues were no longer sufficient to support the military establishments that survival demanded. This economic pressure forced daimyo to become more systematic and ruthless in extracting resources from their territories. Tax rates increased dramatically, new forms of taxation were invented, and traditional exemptions and privileges were eliminated in the pursuit of military efficiency. The romantic ideal of the samurai as a landed gentleman who fought for honor rather than material gain gave way to the reality of professional warriors whose survival depended upon their ability to generate and manage vast amounts of wealth. Arrayed against him was Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of Japan's most powerful daimyo, leading an army of 25,000 seasoned warriors in what was intended to be a leisurely march to the capital. By traditional samurai standards, the outcome was predetermined. Imagawa's forces outnumbered Nobunaga's by more than 8-1, included some of the finest mounted warriors in Japan, and were commanded by a general whose military reputation was legendary. According to all the accepted rules of warfare and honor, Nobunaga should have either fled or prepared for a glorious death in hopeless battle. Instead, he did something that would change the course of Japanese history. He ignored the rules entirely. Rather than meeting Imagawa's army in the open field, where traditional samurai tactics favored the larger force, Nobunaga chose to attack during a violent thunderstorm when visibility was near zero and conventional cavalry charges were impossible. His men, soaked to the skin and barely able to see 20 yards ahead, struck Imagawa's camp while the enemy warriors sheltered from the rain, convinced that no sane commander would attempt battle under such conditions. The Battle of Okehazama lasted less than 2 hours. When the storm cleared, Imagawa Yoshimoto was dead, his army was in full retreat, and a new era of Japanese warfare had begun. Nobunaga had proven that innovation, surprise, and tactical flexibility could triumph over superior numbers and traditional honor, a lesson that would reshape not just military strategy, but the entire samurai worldview. But Okehazama was just the beginning of Nobunaga's revolution. Over the next 20 years, he would systematically dismantle every assumption that had governed samurai culture for centuries, replacing them with a ruthless pragmatism that prioritized results over form, effectiveness over aesthetics, and victory over honor. Nobunaga's treatment of the Buddhist monasteries that had long been protected by samurai reverence for religious authority demonstrated his willingness to shatter sacred traditions when they interfered with his political objectives. The warrior monks of Mount Hiei had maintained their independence for 7 centuries, serving as spiritual teachers to generations of samurai, while also functioning as a powerful military force that could intervene in secular conflicts. When these monks allied themselves with Nobunaga's enemies, his response was swift and terrible. On September 30th, 1571, his armies surrounded the Enryaku-ji monastery complex and set it ablaze. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of monks being burned alive in their temples, ancient libraries reduced to ash, and religious treasures accumulated over centuries being systematically destroyed or looted. The psychological impact of this assault on traditional samurai was devastating. For generations, warriors had seen themselves as protectors of Buddhism, bound by spiritual as well as secular obligations to respect religious authority. Nobunaga's destruction of Enryakuji forced them to confront an agonizing choice: loyalty to their traditional values, or obedience to a lord who demanded that they participate in what many considered sacrilege. Most chose obedience, but the cost was enormous. The samurai who followed Nobunaga's orders at Mount Hiei found themselves complicit in actions that violated their deepest beliefs about the proper relationship between warriors and the sacred. Many composed poems expressing their anguish, while others sought purification through additional religious observances, but few openly defied their lord's commands. Nobunaga's military innovations were equally revolutionary. He was among the first Japanese commanders to recognize the potential of firearms, deploying formations of ashigaru armed with matchlock muskets in ways that traditional samurai found both effective and deeply disturbing. These commoner soldiers, many of them farmers who had taken up weapons for the first time in their lives, could now kill experienced samurai with mechanical efficiency that made mockery of decades of martial training. The Battle of Nagakuti in 1575 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of these new tactics. When the famous Takeda cavalry, the finest mounted warriors in Japan, charged Nobunaga's positions, they were met not with the traditional exchange of arrows and individual combat that had characterized samurai warfare for centuries, but with coordinated volleys of musket fire that cut down men and horses with industrial precision. Takeda Katsuyori's forces included samurai whose families had spent generations perfecting the arts of horsemanship and mounted archery. They were magnificent warriors, trained from childhood in skills that represented the highest achievements of traditional military culture. But their magnificence was irrelevant against enemies who could kill them from hundreds of yards away without ever engaging in the personal combat that had always been the essence of samurai warfare. The destruction of the Takeda cavalry marked more than a military victory. It was the symbolic defeat of everything the traditional samurai had represented. The age of individual heroism and aesthetic warfare was ending, replaced by an era of mass armies, technological innovation, and strategic thinking that valued results over the beauty of the methods used to achieve them. Nobunaga's administrative reforms were equally radical. Traditional samurai governance had been personal and informal, based on relationships of loyalty and obligation that were more emotional than bureaucratic. Nobunaga created systematic institutions that could function regardless of personal relationships, establishing professional standards for everything from tax collection to military service. His economic policies reflected the same revolutionary thinking. Where traditional daimyo had focused primarily on agricultural revenues and treated commerce as a secondary concern, Nobunaga actively promoted trade, created new markets, and understood that economic power was the foundation of military success. He established standardized currencies, eliminated internal trade barriers, and created incentives for technological innovation that would have been unthinkable under the traditional system. The social implications of these changes were staggering. Nobunaga promoted men based on ability rather than birth, elevated commoners to positions of authority over hereditary samurai, and treated traditional class distinctions as obstacles to efficiency rather than sacred principles to be preserved. His most trusted generals included men like Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose peasant origins would have automatically excluded him from military command under the traditional system. This meritocratic approach scandalized traditional samurai, who had always assumed that leadership was a birthright that could not be earned through mere competence. But Nobunaga's success in unifying central Japan through these unconventional methods forced even his critics to acknowledge that effectiveness might be more important than pedigree. The psychological impact of serving under Nobunaga was profound and often traumatic for traditional samurai. They found themselves participating in actions that violated their deepest convictions, following orders that contradicted everything they had been taught about proper warrior behavior, and achieving success through methods that their ancestors would have considered dishonorable. Many dealt with this cognitive dissonance through elaborate mental gymnastics, convincing themselves that their lord's revolutionary methods were actually expressions of deeper traditional values. They argued that true loyalty required adaptation to changing circumstances, that genuine honor demanded effectiveness rather than adherence to outdated forms, and that the unification of Japan justified temporary departures from conventional morality. Others found the contradictions unbearable and chose death over continued participation in what they saw as the betrayal of everything they held sacred. The number of samurai who committed seppuku during Nobunaga's campaigns was unusually high, reflecting the psychological stress created by his demands for behavior that traditional warriors found deeply problematic. But perhaps the most significant group were those who embraced Nobunaga's revolution wholeheartedly, recognizing that the world had changed in ways that made traditional samurai values obsolete. These warriors became the nucleus of a new type of military professional, men who retained the discipline and courage of their ancestors, while abandoning the aesthetic and spiritual constraints that had limited traditional effectiveness. Nobunaga's own fate demonstrated both the power and the limitations of his revolutionary approach. On June 21st, 1582, while staying at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with only a small bodyguard, he was attacked by forces led by his own general, Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded and facing certain defeat, Nobunaga chose to commit seppuku rather than fall into enemy hands. His death was both traditional and revolutionary, traditional in its form and courage, revolutionary in its circumstances and implications. The man who had transformed Japanese warfare died according to ancient samurai custom, but his death created a succession crisis that would complete the transformation he had begun. The reasons for Akechi Mitsuhide's betrayal remain debated by historians, but the most likely explanation involves the psychological tensions that Nobunaga's revolutionary methods had created within the samurai class. Mitsuhide was a traditional warrior who had served Nobunaga faithfully for years, while gradually becoming more disturbed by his lord's willingness to violate sacred customs and religious obligations. The destruction of Enryakuji, the promotion of commoners over hereditary samurai, and the systematic elimination of traditional constraints on warfare had created deep resentment among those who saw themselves as guardians of authentic samurai values. Mitsuhide's rebellion was not just a political coup, but a religious and cultural restoration attempt, an effort to return Japan to the values and methods that had governed samurai life for centuries. But the revolution had gone too far to be reversed. Within days of Nobunaga's death, his lieutenant Toyotomi Hideyoshi was marching to avenge his master and complete the unification that Nobunaga had begun. The forces of traditional restoration would be crushed, and Japan would continue its transformation into something unprecedented in its history. As the fire burns lower tonight, we can almost hear the clash of old and new echoing across the battlefields of 16th century Japan, the thunder of cavalry charges meeting musket volleys, the prayers of monks as their temples burned, and the anguished poetry of samurai torn between loyalty and conscience. Nobunaga's revolution had shattered the foundations of a 1,000-year-old civilization, but from those fragments, something new and powerful was being born. The Demon King, as his enemies called him, had died as he had lived, violently, dramatically, and in ways that forced everyone around him to confront the inadequacy of traditional responses to revolutionary challenges. His legacy would shape not just the immediate future of Japan, but the fundamental character of samurai culture for the centuries to come. In the aftermath of Nobunaga's death at Honnoji, Japan trembled on the edge of chaos. The great unifier was gone, killed by one of his own generals in a betrayal that threatened to plunge the country back into the endless warfare that had consumed it for over a century. But from this crisis emerged a figure so unlikely, so unprecedented, that his very existence challenged every assumption about birth, destiny, and the nature of power itself. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was not born to rule. The son of a peasant farmer in Owari province, he entered Nobunaga's service as a common foot soldier, carrying sandals for his betters and performing the menial tasks that hereditary samurai considered beneath their dignity. Yet within 40 years, this man of humble origins would complete the unification of Japan, transform the social structure of the nation, and establish himself as the supreme ruler of an empire that stretched from the southern islands of Kyushu to the northern mountains of Honshu. Hideyoshi's rise began in the immediate aftermath of Nobunaga's assassination. While other generals hesitated, uncertain how to respond to the crisis, Hideyoshi acted with the decisiveness that had made him Nobunaga's most trusted lieutenant. Learning of his master's death while campaigning against the Mori clan in western Japan, he immediately concluded a hasty peace treaty and raced back toward Kyoto with his entire army. The speed of Hideyoshi's response caught Akechi Mitsuhide completely off guard. The rebel general had expected weeks or months to consolidate his position and build support for his restoration of traditional values. Instead, he found himself facing Hideyoshi's veteran troops just 11 days after the assassination, at the Battle of Yamazaki on July 2nd, 1582. The battle was brief and decisive. Mitsuhide's forces, hastily assembled and uncertain of their cause, collapsed under the assault of seasoned warriors, fighting to avenge their beloved commander. Mitsuhide himself was killed while fleeing the battlefield, reportedly by a peasant bandit, who didn't even recognize the significance of his victim. The traditional restoration was over before it had truly begun. But Hideyoshi's victory at Yamazaki created as many problems as it solved. He was not Nobunaga's designated heir. That honor belonged to his infant grandson, Oda Hidenobu. Nor was he the most senior of Nobunaga's generals. That distinction belonged to men like Shibata Katsui and Tokugawa Ieyasu, whose samurai lineages stretch back for generations. By all traditional measures, Hideyoshi had no legitimate claim to supreme authority. What he possessed instead was something more valuable than birth or formal position: the absolute loyalty of Nobunaga's most effective military units and the political intelligence to understand how power actually worked in the new Japan that was emerging from the chaos of the Sengoku period. Hideyoshi had learned from his master that results mattered more than protocols, that effectiveness trumped legitimacy, and that the man who could deliver victory and stability would be accepted as ruler regardless of his origins. The struggle for Nobunaga's inheritance would take 3 more years of warfare, negotiation, and political maneuvering. Hideyoshi faced challenges from multiple directions: Shibata Katsuie in the north, the Mori clan in the west, the Tokugawa in the east, and various other daimyo who saw opportunity in the succession crisis. Each enemy had significant advantages: better bloodlines, larger territories, more traditional claims to authority. But Hideyoshi possessed something that none of his rivals could match: the common touch that allowed him to appeal to the Ashigaru and lower-ranking samurai who formed the backbone of 16th century armies. Where traditional daimyo maintained elaborate social distances from their subordinates, Hideyoshi moved among his troops with easy familiarity, sharing their hardships and understanding their concerns in ways that aristocratic commanders could never manage. This accessibility was not mere political calculation, but reflected Hideyoshi's genuine understanding of what motivated common soldiers. Having risen from their ranks himself, he knew that loyalty was earned through shared sacrifice rather than inherited privilege, that men fought best for leaders who treated them as valued partners rather than disposable tools. The decisive campaign came in 1583, when Hideyoshi crushed Shibata Katsui's forces at the Battle of Shizugatake. The victory was achieved through a combination of strategic brilliance and tactical innovation that demonstrated how completely Hideyoshi had absorbed Nobunaga's lessons about the importance of flexibility and adaptation. Rather than meeting Shibata's army in conventional battle, Hideyoshi divided his forces and struck at multiple points simultaneously, preventing his enemy from concentrating superior numbers at any single location. His troops moved with unprecedented speed and coordination, covering vast distances in forced marches that would have broken less disciplined armies. But perhaps most importantly, Hideyoshi understood that modern warfare was as much about logistics and intelligence as about courage and martial skill. His victories were built on superior information networks, more efficient supply systems, and better coordination between different units, advantages that reflected organizational abilities rather than traditional warrior virtues. With Shibata Katsui's defeat and subsequent suicide, Hideyoshi became the undisputed master of central Japan. But rather than resting on his achievements, he immediately began planning for the completion of national unification, a task that would require him to defeat or co-opt every remaining independent daimyo in the country. The Kyushu campaign of 1587 demonstrated Hideyoshi's evolution from brilliant general to master strategist. Rather than simply overwhelming the island's defenders through superior force, he employed a sophisticated combination of military pressure, diplomatic inducements, and economic incentives that made resistance seem both futile and unnecessary. Individual daimyo were offered generous terms for submission. They could retain their lands and titles in exchange for acknowledgement of Hideyoshi's supreme authority. Those who accepted were rewarded with additional territories, confiscated from more stubborn opponents. Those who refused faced not just military defeat, but complete destruction, their lands redistributed, their families eliminated, their very names erased from history. This carrot and stick approach proved remarkably effective. Most Kyushu daimyo chose submission over resistance, recognizing that Hideyoshi's offer represented their best chance for survival in the new order that was emerging. By the end of 1587, the entire island was under Hideyoshi's control, achieved with relatively little bloodshed and minimal disruption to the existing social order. The final major obstacle to complete unification was the Hojo clan, which controlled the vast Kanto region around modern-day Tokyo. The Hojo were among Japan's most powerful and traditional daimyo, ruling from their impregnable fortress at Odawara and commanding the loyalty of thousands of samurai who had never known defeat. Hideyoshi's siege of Odawara in 1590 became the largest military operation in Japanese history to that point, involving over 200,000 troops and lasting nearly 4 months. But this was not the desperate assault of a military adventurer gambling everything on a single victory. It was the systematic application of overwhelming force by a ruler who controlled the resources of most of Japan. The siege demonstrated Hideyoshi's complete mastery of 16th century warfare. Rather than attempting costly frontal assaults on Odawara's massive fortifications, he simply surrounded the castle and waited. His armies were supplied by sophisticated logistics networks that could sustain hundreds of thousands of men indefinitely, while the defenders gradually consumed their stockpiled resources. More psychologically devastating than the military pressure was the recognition among the Hojo retainers that they were facing not just another daimyo, but the representative of a new order that had already absorbed the rest of Japan. Stories of Hideyoshi's generosity to submissive enemies and his ruthlessness toward the stubborn gradually undermined the defenders' will to resist. When Odawara finally surrendered in July 1590, Hideyoshi's unification of Japan was complete. For the first time in over a century, the entire country was under the control of a single ruler. The age of warring states was over, and a new era of centralized authority had begun. But Hideyoshi's achievements went far beyond military conquest. His social and economic reforms fundamentally altered the structure of Japanese society. in ways that would influence the country for centuries to come. The most significant of these was the rigid separation of social classes that relegated farmers, artisans, and merchants to clearly defined positions below the samurai elite. This class system was not simply a return to traditional arrangements, but rather a revolutionary innovation that served Hideyoshi's political needs. By preventing social mobility and clearly defining everyone's place in the hierarchy, he created stability while also ensuring that no future peasant could follow his own path to supreme power. The famous sword hunt of 1588 exemplified this policy. Hideyoshi ordered all non-samurai to surrender their weapons, ostensibly to provide metal for a great Buddha statue, but actually to eliminate the armed peasant bands that had played such important roles in Sengoku warfare. The weapons were indeed melted down for religious purposes, but the real goal was to establish a clear monopoly on violence for the samurai class. This policy reflected Hideyoshi's complex relationship with his own origins. Having risen to power through the very social mobility he now sought to eliminate, he understood better than anyone how dangerous such opportunities could be to established authority. His reforms were designed to prevent future Hideyoshis from emerging to challenge the order he had created. The economic implications of unification were equally significant. For the first time in centuries, merchants could travel freely throughout Japan without worrying about local warfare or arbitrary taxation by individual daimyo. Standardized currencies replaced the chaotic mixture of local coinages that had complicated trade. Roads were improved and extended to facilitate both commercial and military movement. These changes created unprecedented prosperity for those positioned to take advantage of them. The merchant class, previously regarded with suspicion by traditional samurai, found new opportunities for wealth accumulation and social influence. Cities grew rapidly as centers of trade and manufacturing, creating urban cultures that were quite different from the rural agricultural societies that had dominated Japan for centuries. But perhaps Hideyoshi's most ambitious project was his attempt to expand Japanese power beyond the home islands through the invasion of Korea. The campaigns of 1592 to 1598 represented the first time in Japanese history that the country had attempted large-scale overseas conquest, and they demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of Hideyoshi's new military machine. The initial invasion was spectacularly successful. Japanese armies, hardened by decades of civil war and equipped with the latest firearms technology, quickly overran Korean defenses and advanced deep into the peninsula. Seoul fell within weeks, and for a brief moment, it seemed that Hideyoshi's dreams of conquering China itself might actually be achievable. But the Korean campaigns also revealed the challenges of projecting power across water barriers and maintaining supply lines over vast distances. Chinese intervention, Korean guerrilla warfare, and the sheer scale of the logistical requirements gradually wore down Japanese forces that had seemed invincible on their home islands. The failure of the Korean invasions marked the beginning of Hideyoshi's decline. The enormous costs in men and resources weakened his military position, while the prolonged absence of Japanese troops created opportunities for domestic dissent. More fundamentally, the campaigns demonstrated that even Hideyoshi's revolutionary military machine had limits that could not be overcome through superior organization and innovative tactics. When Hideyoshi died on September 18, 1598, he left behind a unified Japan, but also a succession crisis that would determine whether his achievements would endure or collapse like so many previous attempts at centralization. His heir, Toyotomi Hideyori, was only 5 years old, too young to command the loyalty and respect that had made his father's rule possible. The real question was not whether the Toyotomi dynasty would survive, but whether the unification itself could endure the transition from the charismatic leadership of its founder to the institutional authority of his successors. The answer would come from an unexpected direction. The patient strategist, who had waited in the shadows, while others fought for immediate glory. As the flames flicker lower in our fireplace tonight, we can almost hear the victory celebrations echoing across the courtyards of Osaka Castle, where Hideyoshi held court as the supreme ruler of a unified nation. But those celebrations were tinged with the knowledge that all human achievements are temporary, that even the most unlikely success stories must eventually give way to new chapters written by different hands. The peasant who had become a god through his own efforts had created something larger than himself, but whether that creation could survive without his personal guidance remained to be seen. In the eastern provinces, Tokugawa Ieyasu was quietly preparing for the final act of Japan's unification drama, an act that would be longer, more patient, and ultimately more enduring than anything his predecessors had achieved.